David Scott is an Ojibwe traditional knowledge keeper, Indigenous environmental expert, and researcher of treaty and Aboriginal rights. In his 48 years of experience in these areas, David has facilitated community-led research and traditional knowledge camps, taught widely about land claims, the Indian Act, and governmental policies that affect Indigenous people, and undertaken field studies on the impacts of Manitoba Hydro's infrastructural developments in Manitoba. As committee member with many Manitoba First Nations, David has worked in community engagement and consultation, particularly in relation to Section 35 of the Constitution Act. In addition to the traditional knowledge he holds, David is fluent in both Ojibwe and Saulteaux, and English, I would add.
So good.
Not so good in the English? Dave started working with his band at the age of 16 when they recognized that he could provide help and assistance in navigating this world that they found themselves in. He's also the kind of guy who's ended up in the vicinity of prime ministers, and he's the kind of guy who's not afraid to confront them directly to their face, which has happened with a couple of Trudeaus. I met Dave briefly. I met Dave roughly 10 years ago at a conference in northern Manitoba. We sat on a research committee at the U of M for a while related to hydro impacts in the north. I live in the Morden area, like about an hour, a little less than an hour east of Swan Lake First Nation, where Dave lives. He has spoken at many events in that area and elsewhere, churches, schools, etc., Hutterite colonies, and that has been very helpful. And he's very involved in the schools as well in that area, and has run an intercultural summer program for how many years? 5 years, bringing together Indigenous youth and other youth, doing environmental monitoring, management. I call it, like, to me it looks like spying on muskrats and going camping. But I think you do more than that. And it's a program that has the potential to change lives. And Finn is one of the people who has been involved in that. I'm not sure whether I read the blurb about, I'll read the blurb about you now. Who will be presenting as well. Finn Rachul is Mennonite by background, grew up in the Morden area, has been working with Dave for 5 years on subjects such as traditional Ojibwe environmental knowledge, truth and reconciliation, and land-based teaching. Finn was traditionally adopted by Dave and his family 3 years ago, has become part of the Ojibwe community in Swan Lake First Nation. And I remember you when you were about this old, maybe, sitting in the Morden Library, listening to a presentation by Dave Scott. So it's interesting how things develop over time. And I'll let you will share your story and people will learn more about you. I have known Dave as somebody, as an ambassador, is sort of how I see him, somebody who reaches out on behalf of his community. And he's got a phenomenal network of connections. He knows my neighbors better than I know my neighbors, and that's hardly even an exaggeration. The late Menno Wiebe, who was a wise and visionary ambassador for our people, talked about the importance of people-to-people relationships, and we as Mennonites have far fewer of those relationships with Indigenous people than we used to, especially Indigenous people outside of cities. So connections with people like Dave are very valuable. There are probably not very many Indigenous people in Manitoba who know more about Mennonites than you do. So that connection is very valuable, and it's good to have here. Now, it's interesting to note that David Scott knows things about Mennonite history that no Mennonite historians do, and that's part of why he's here today. About 3 years ago, I stopped by his place with my sons and my nephew, and we were sitting on his porch, and he started talking about this oral history of a handshake treaty between Mennonites and the Ojibwe, which I had never heard of. So that's sort of, we'll learn a bit more of that today, and that's, I guess, a year later, roughly, or in February of 2 years ago, a group of us, Mennonite folks, 15 or 20, went to Swan Lake to hear this story more fully. And that kind of led to Jonathan Dick and Dave together working on the book that we'll be talking about, The Secret Treaty, here. And I wanted to, well, you're not seeing it on the screen right now, but it has showed up on the screen at different points. I want to acknowledge as well some of the people, just name some of the people from whom this story, through who this story has been passed down. People from Swan Lake. John Swain, who heard it from his father, Mike Swain. Marie Gordon, who heard it from Joe Walker. Don Daniels, who heard it from Sam Cameron. And Dave's father, Simon Scott, who heard it from his grandfather, Walter Scott. In some sense, all Mennonite experts of Mennonite, a little bit of Mennonite history, and people worth acknowledging. So Jonathan will share a little bit later as well. Grew up in the Morden Winkler area. Graduate of CMU. He's the author of Shelter Belts, which was Manitoba Book of the Year a couple years ago. His design illustration work has appeared in the Walrus, the Goulburn Mail, and Canadian Mennonite magazine, and elsewhere. So, Dave has been very generous in sharing his time, his heart, and the stories of his community with Mennonites. That is a great gift to us, so I want to acknowledge that generosity in what you've shared with us, and we're very fortunate to have you here. Welcome.
There's technology up here. Somebody better come and rescue it because I'll destroy it. Is there some reason this is here? I hope you don't want me to use that. No. Oh, okay. Okay, good. Thank you, Will. Good morning, everyone. I'm truly honored for the invitation to speak about a large part of Canadian history that has not been told and has been kept from the minds of those that have come to this land. I want to thank the panelists that spoke yesterday, and also I want to thank those of you who came with beards. Mustaches will do as well. Yesterday I was very concerned that I was not seeing people with beards. And in some of the stories we have with German-speaking people, we call them Mishidun, the bearded people. So I was trying to nail that down. We're getting closer, but we'll figure that out. But there are other words that were used to describe the people we met. I'm talking specifically about the German-speaking people. In our culture, when you hear a sound, you can connect it with a particular thing, just like a bird. You know what a bird sounds like, right? Well, German people have a particular sound to the language they use. So we connected all of those together. So the other word that we used was Gashashaganisdeod, which is the barefooted people, which we now know. My brother called me yesterday and says, no, those were the Ukrainian people. Okay, and then there was the Kagedimagziod, the persecuted ones. This was what became known as the Mennonite people. And just thinking about that and thinking about our history as Indigenous people, I guess we would have had a good connection in that area. Kichinika sat on the hill south of the city of Morden, and he said these words: "They have taken our lands that we have tried to save for our children and for the children yet unborn. We will not be able to survive. We are weak, we are sick, we have no land. The promises that were made were not honest. There is no honor in the words of the light-skinned people. Our journey with them has come to an end." This would have been said around the 1880s, after a lot of us were destroyed by starvation, confinement to Indian reserves, that kind of thing. So, my name is David Scott. I was born in 1960. I was born a citizen of Canada, but a person under the Indian Act. We were defined in the Indian Act. We were defined a person was, under the law, in British common law, they describe us as this in the Indian Act. A person is anyone other than an Indian in Canadian law, in British common law at that time. So began our journey. I was raised on the Swan Lake Indian Reserve. You'll hear me use those words, Indian. I don't use words like First Nation or any of those political words. I am an Indian in this country, legally, and I am living on an Indian reserve. I occupy an Indian reserve. So that's why you'll hear me say those words. We are located southwest of the city of Winnipeg, approximately 20 minutes from the United States border in central Manitoba. I was raised a traditional person by my grandparents and my parents, and by the many old people of my community. They were all traditional people. My paternal grandfather, Mijakibinas, which is the Walter Scott that's in this book, lived in the days of Chief Ozawigwan, Chief Yellowquill. Chief Yellowquill was the chief that signed Treaty 1 in 1871 on behalf of our people. Mijakibinas died in the house I was raised in at the age of 108. The old people of my community were all traditional people. They lived their entire lives in my community. They lived off the land as much as they could or were allowed to. And their teachings are from their life experiences and the teaching of their ancestors. I have benefited from their knowledge and their teachings. They taught me by the same methods used for centuries, handing stories down from one generation to the next. My language, my culture, my spirituality is all that I am and who I have chosen to be. Funny story about that. Back when I started working in Swan Lake at the age of 16, in just conversations with the band administrator and the chief of the day, I said, I want to go to university one day. And then the chief, who was a traditional man, says, you give me a minute there. And he went and got all the old people in the reserve, and they were all sitting on the front lawn. I thought, oh, my new job, I'm going to get fired or I got in trouble. You know, because every time the old people got together and they were talking about me, it's because I did something. So they eventually called me out, and I went and sat with them, and one of my guima, my teacher, he said to me and looked me straight in the eye, he said, not you. You can't do that. You can't change the way you think about who you are as an Ojibwe person. Western education will do that to you. So I never did go formally to universities. I mean, I snuck into all of these universities and took courses. I was only interested in the tools, not so much the grades. I mean, this one here, I came here probably around 1977. I snuck into the school here, and they caught me, threw me out. I said, well, there's one more down the road. So I went to the University of Manitoba. That's my formal education. I do not accept, nor do I seek validation from any Canadian institution for the things I know about who I am as an Ojibwe person. I do not have letters attached to my name because there is no institutional degree in the knowledge I have, nor should there be. I live who I am. I speak my language fluently. I live my culture and practice my traditions and believe in the spirituality of my people. I have become a teacher now, a teacher that can accommodate all who live with me on this land. The first law of the Ojibwe is to see people as human beings first. All people, no matter the color of their skin or whatever God they pray to. This is the teaching of Abimadizi, human beings. Colonialism has deep and stubborn roots. I have struggled with this concept all of my working life, to bring people of this land from colonialistic paternalism to a more balanced form of understanding one another. There is a need, now more than ever, in this time of truth and reconciliation, for this to happen. Our peoples to work together and develop understanding, trust, and respect. In the absence of understanding one another, in the absence of trusting each other, in the absence of respecting one another, we will continue to turn to our assumptions of one another. And it is these assumptions that gives life to hatred. We have expressed our willingness to explore whatever is necessary to keep us on a proactive path of reconciling our differences. If we are willing to listen and discuss with open minds the issues that keeps us apart, no matter how difficult, we can push back the forces of hatred. A good first step has been taken by myself, Jonathan Dick, and Will Braun in getting out this story. This story brings to light that we did have a basis of a good relationship. We did start on the right foot. The book, The Secret Treaty, has finally gotten our story out there. The title tells a lot about the breakdown of our relationship. Why was it a secret treaty? Why was it not widely known? Why was it hidden? Why can we not take the steps to prepare our relationship as the treaty intended? The history of our relationship has been deliberately hidden in the Western society that has come to be known as Canada. Throughout my discussions with Western society, I keep getting asked these two questions. How do we coexist? And how can we coexist when one side is so destructive? As an Ojibwe person, I have tried to answer this question. The institutions of this country are set up in favor of Western society and culture. The rules have prevented our people from being heard. I have been taught to respect all that is living on earth and to live in harmony with nature. My elders and I are aware of the inherent conflict between these two ways of life. To quote one of the old people of my reserve, in order not to hear us, they hide behind these rules. In order not to hear us, shame was put upon all newcomers who came onto this land, and it was shameful for them to speak to us. On one of the days of the negotiations of Treaty 1, my great-grandfather, there's a picture of him in one of these things, his name was Kachinika. That was my mother's grandfather, my grandmother's father. On one of those days, Kachinika, Big Goose, rose and said these words, "Your God has no place amongst my people." In turn, Chief Yellowquill then rose and said this, "We ask that you do not repeat the mistakes of the past. Do not assume that our willingness to accommodate you is a sign of weakness. We are the same kind-hearted people that you met when you walked onto our mother. We will do right by you because we respect life." I don't know, I'm not a Western thinker. Am I supposed to say quote, unquote? Or is it okay if can I just skip over that formality? My grandfather would have laughed at that. Quit talking in English, he would have told me. I will say this, English is not my first language. Ojibwe is. So sometimes I have to pause so my translation catches up. I'm sure you German-speaking people understand that. The laws and history of this country and the belief systems that came to our shores have prevented our peoples from living together in harmony. They prevented us from looking at one another as human beings and speaking to one another's communities directly. Despite this history, it is my hope that our peoples, all of our peoples, take seriously this opportunity to resolve the difficulties we face. One of the key issues is the spirit and intent of treaty alongside its results. Sharing the land and its abundance with those that came here with nothing but the clothes on their backs and in need of our assistance to exist was a responsibility our people took upon themselves. We heard a lot about big mosquitoes yesterday. Well, we know about big mosquitoes. There's lots of stories about the mosquitoes. Even the commissioner that was traveling across to come and do treaty with us, he was complaining because he had to get the savages to come and help him pull his ox cart through the mud, and the mosquitoes were unbearable. And then he said, and it cost me 3 barrels of pork. So that was what the Indians of the day charged him, was 3 barrels of pork to push this goofy guy coming through these areas at the wrong time of the year. There is a joke amongst our old people about that, and they laughed. They put the grid system in the reserves, or they put the grid system in Canada. That's 1 square mile, you know. And the old people used to, I guess they were sitting and wondering, why are they doing this? They must have really lazy horses. So you have these little stories, but those little stories tell a big story about where our thinking was and why these things were in such conflict with the way we lived our lives. The 1 square mile system that was put in place in our reserve came in 1932. And we have some large wetland areas that were destroyed because of the grid system. Places that we hunted for food and picked medicines. And then they had a railroad that came through. And then the highway came through right across the middle of the reserve. And these things that were done to our people, we took it on the chin, you know, well, that's what they do, so let's just go along with it. But now we're seeing the results of that. I live in the northwest section of our reserve at Swan Lake, and I'm displaced from the main community because all around me are provincial high roads and a provincial highway. So my part of the reserve is separate from the other reserve. And then across the south part of the highway, there's a section in the Indian Act, it's Section 30, it's a trespass law. No white man is to trespass on Indian lands. Now, when they started putting Indian agents on our lands, they've had to put that great big 2-story white house in the middle of the reserve. But that law, the trespass law, there's no white man can trespass on Indian land. So what they did was we were forced into surrendering roads so that that white man can get to his big white house, right? I remember the last one that was there. And it was a massive big, I remember playing in that building when I was a kid before it burned down. I'm not saying I did anything like that. But when we look at these things now and trying to take the steps to correct those things that happened back in those days, more and more of these things are coming to light by what our people intended. The Indian Act is pervasive in our communities. It controlled everything in our lives, from handling money, selling crops, selling animals, even to feed ourselves. It was in control. My dad was a farmer, and he couldn't kill one of his own animals to feed his own family. And there were 13 of us. So that was one whole cow and one meal. Right? So we couldn't do that because the animals that we raised, the crops that we grew, were the Queen's property. We couldn't even kill our own animal to feed ourselves. But we had relationships with the people that lived around us. There was a lot of people that we had relationships with to help us. Section 30 of the Indian Act, a big part of that was to ensure that white people did not know what the government was doing inside those reserves. That's what that section was all about. So when these things started coming to light, and the last Indian agent was seen flying down the road, and he didn't even care that he was crossing Indian land. He just got out of there, right? So that was the last thing. And our reserve at Swan Lake, we've always been called, and we're still called that troublesome band of Indians is what we're called. Only because we didn't want to play with those rules that they were making for us. To tell you how much power the Indian Act had on our lives, there was a lady from Somerset that sold wood alcohol to 4 of our people at Swan Lake, and they died. They were poisoned. They couldn't charge that lady for killing 4 Indian people. She got charged for selling alcohol to an Indian under the Indian Act. Because remember, we were not human beings. Governments, churches can punish us with impunity because we were not human beings. When the wars came, our people had to give up their status to join the Canadian armies. And one of the things, if you wanted to become a human being under Canadian law, one of the things you had to do was you had to become a Christian. That was one of the things that we had to do. And then there was a few other things. And then they put you on probation for 5 years, right? So those were the things that the Indian agents had a lot of power over the people under their charge. They could interpret law, they could make policy, they could do whatever it was they wanted in order to keep the Indian confined to the Indian reserves. That's the power of the Indian agents back in those days. We are still landless people in this country. Most of us that were supposed to be on treaty land are still landless Indians. We only occupy our reserves. The land is still held by the Queen, in this case the King. It's still held, so we just occupy those reserves. That land we can't sell, we can't mortgage it, we can't even tax our own citizens. Not that there's anything there to tax, right? When the government said that you will live free from the molestation of government, that was one of the promises. Well, we've been molested ever since. Before the ink dried on Treaty 1, the sale of land, the displacement of our people was in full throttle in this part of the country. And it was to bring in immigrants so they can be taxed. So that's what happened at that time. Canada did not have any money whatsoever, and they needed immigration, and they needed to move people out into the prairies so they can tax them. So the powers of government was pervasive in our lives. In our culture and in our beliefs, it was natural for us to take care of others, as this is a part of our first law of looking at people as human beings first. To this day, our names for places throughout this area have been taken away. Our heritage erased from these locations, and our culture outlawed and marginalized. We have been forced onto Indian reserves to live according to the Indian Act, a document created by and enforced by British colonial governments. I'm getting to the book, believe me, but I do get long-winded at times. This is not what the spirit or intent of treaty making according to the practices of the Ojibwe people, but this is what happened regardless. Much has been lost in this process of attempting to assimilate and annihilate Ojibwe culture. The shame put upon white society for associating with indigenous peoples, Christians in particular, by the governments of that time was an attempt to kill the treaties that were happening on the ground. Many such treaties were created between the Ojibwe and people groups like the Mennonite and the Ukrainians, with the assumption of reciprocal aid in times of need. Interaction between communities was frequent despite initiatives to prevent them. Treaties like this were against Canadian law and Christian society at the time, as the Ojibwe people were looked on as pagans and devil worshippers and in need of civilization. However, as time went on, treaties fell apart due to intense government pushes to outlaw and marginalize Indian people and preventing us from associating or being associated with Indian people. There's a fellow that had a conversation with me here this morning, and he brought to mind a policy that was implemented across Canada. It's called the Peasant Farm Policy. When Indians started outproducing our neighbors in terms of crops, and that they didn't want that to discourage the newcomers to this area, to this land. And there was a commissioner named Hayter Reed who wrote up a policy. It's called the Peasant Farm Policy. That policy was intended to discourage indigenous people from succeeding in their farming practices. We were not allowed to use mechanized tools, whatever the mechanized tools of the day were. We couldn't help each other in our farms. If 3 of us were seen in an open field somewhere, we could be charged for incitement to riot. Under that policy, in year 1, an Indian could clear the land but leave a 4-foot stump. And they were not to touch that stump until the following year. They could take out that stump. And they could not cultivate that land until the following year. And they could not plant their crop until the following year. That's how long it took us to put in one crop. And then, under the pass and permit system, you couldn't sell your crop to anybody in the free open market. You had to sell it to the Indian agent, and the Indian agent would go and sell it for whatever, and he didn't know what he was selling it for. And he took his big cut and told you, give me a list of what it is you want, and we'll give you a piece of paper that you can go to Portage and purchase what it is you want. And it was never what was on the list. My dad used to always say that. We needed 13 pair of shoes, but we got 3. Right? So these are the kinds of things that happen under that policy. And mechanized tools could not. I know in this area, in the Swan Lake area, it was a group of the Indian reserves that got together to purchase a threshing machine. And they took it away on us. You couldn't do that. You couldn't help each other. You couldn't share tools. You couldn't share any of the what you might call profits. You couldn't do that. It was also against that law, and it's actually a policy. It wasn't a law, But it was a policy that was implemented by a number of Indian agents across the country. And that was that Indians were not allowed to handle money. It was against the law for us to actually handle money. You could go to jail for 5 days in St. Cloud if you got caught with cash. So there are lots of secret deals that were going back and forth with our neighbors. There were a lot of good people out there. And that's what's missing in these histories that I talk about. There were things that could happen. The story, the secret treaty, has been reduced to embarrassing secrets for many. The termination of this treaty, in particular, the secret treaty with the Mennonites, happened because of the reserve system and the allocation of land. The displacement of our people from our traditional lands was also a large part of breaking down who we are as a people of the land. The treaty between the Mennonites and the Ojibwe happened sometime in the spring of 1875. Our people did not measure time in terms of annual calendars or watches on our wrists. In oral history storytelling, time is measured by the season or tied to a particular event or events or the age of the storyteller. So it's very important when we do these stories that we know where the story comes from. Whose story was it? Who witnessed these stories? In my work, I've always used 4 people telling the same story in a general location. It must be 4 people. Then you can say, well, that's pretty much sure, but knowing where that story comes from is a very, very key part of validating. And again, because we have to validate these stories, because Western society needs that, under their hat, so we have to do something like that. So a group of us oral historians have begun to put some standardization in the oral history that we tell. And this is one of those stories that was first introduced into our group to try and get some validation from other people. How do we know that this treaty happened in the spring of 1875? And this is an example of how this works. In one of the stories that is told by our people is that Kichinika had just completed his ceremonial responsibilities in the open plains of what is now known as Altona. His ceremonies would have been carried out in the spring. And knowing that the Mennonites were just moving into the area the previous year, it would have been at this point that there was contact made between the two. At initial contact, the Mennonites meeting Kichinika as he was just finishing his ceremonies were said to have run in fear. Again, Western society was taught to be afraid of us. They made us into boogeymen, devils, devil worshippers. That's what they called us. And so the people that came here, not knowing any better, like the movie last night, like playing with a skunk, that's not something you do. Now, if they came and asked me, I would have told them, go ahead, because I'm a prankster, right? So these little things like that, these little experiences that people have are the same kinds of things in how we learned to become part of the land that we lived on. At initial however, the Ojibwe party managed to catch them and calm them down, presumably with hand gestures or some form of translation. But there is a story out there, and I'm gonna do a little bit more research on this, where we can recognize that the languages that were being spoken were not the languages of the British people. It was the British that we had severe problems with. In our language, we say Jaganashimo, people that speak with that have harsh language, and it's like talking with glass in your mouth, that kind of a thing, right? It was a harsh language. And that's a negative word, and that's a Soto word, by the way. And the next one was the French people, which we call them Wabishki, which is a positive word because we had a positive relationship with them. And then all the other different languages that came, French, Ukrainian, and I forget what the other group was, they all kind of sounded the same. So that's why we use those words to describe them. And we just put you all in the same boat. Sorry about that. During the communications between and afterward, it was learned that the Mennonite, somebody has to keep track of my time, otherwise I'll just keep going. It was learned that the Mennonites were a pacifist people that were often persecuted in the lands that they came from. The Ojibwe learned that the Mennonites would not raise an army against us. The two groups would sit and discuss for some time, eventually creating a treaty between the peoples in agreement to learn from one another and help in times of need. Getting to know people that we made treaties with was a big part of that. We just didn't go around willy-nilly having treaties all over the place when we didn't know who we were treating with, right? I have never, in all of the many, many historical records that I have, has the Ojibwe people in this area ever made treaty with British people other than Treaty 1, because that was proven to be wishful thinking, right? And it was deliberate in their acts. So we never trusted the British people. Sorry if anybody from here is from Britain, but that's history. Knowledge sharing was a large part of this treaty, with the Ojibwe helping the Mennonites to survive on this new land, and the Mennonites teaching what they knew as well. Of particular interest to the Ojibwe people was why they farmed their crops in straight lines, as well as what plants they were growing. The crops that were in straight lines freaked us out. Because in our gardens, we used contour gardening, so our lines were never straight. And when we seen that, because for us, knowledge of the land is not just about a particular plant, it's everything around it and all the things that it requires, right? Water was one of those things, right? So we were freaked out by things that were being grown in straight lines. And this story comes from way before we met the Mennonites. This story comes from a council that was held at what people called the Dead Horse Creek now. There was a large Ojibwe council held there in around 1817. It was to discuss the 49th parallel. And in our story, it goes like this. They are drawing lines on the ground that we cannot see, and that they will eventually imprison us as it will imprison them. So these stories, and then, oh boy, I wonder where their minds went when they started putting those squares on the ground with roads, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. The lines that the lines that could not be seen only by those that drew them. We understood these lines as lines that will imprison us as well as those that use them. Getting back to the question of how do we coexist. During my early years, when I didn't know my ass from my elbow, I asked myself, how do I make my Ojibwe knowledge relevant? Or how do I fit my knowledge into the Western thinking model? What does Indigenous knowledge consist of? Well, to me, it's about my relationship with people, my interactions with the environment and all living things, as well as my spirituality. It is this understanding that helps me survive and for me to identify my place in the world. I had a recent scare with cancer. For the past several years, on and off my deathbed, three things come to mind. my spirituality, Western medicine, and the medicines of my ancestors. We cannot find the plants that I required in the vicinity of my reserve, so that we had to go and get them from as far away as Island Lake. The displacement of our people has caused us to go further and further to get the medicines we need. Although we know where they are close to us in our area, we are scared of contamination from agricultural chemicals and the effects that might have on our health. During my battle with cancer, I was able to use the 3 ways to deal with this disease, not one over the other. A balanced approach combining Western medicines and the medicine of my ancestors to treat what I was dealing with. When this understanding is measured against a Western scientific model, we are viewed as primitive, as living within a mythological world under some form of magic. Western science looks at statistical probabilities, that if the subject matter can be tested and validated, then and only then is it considered useful or important. The dismissal of our knowledge is based on this principle. If something cannot be tested, retested, and precisely measured, it is declared invalid and not of value to Western science. Oral history, how am I doing for time? Does everybody forget about the time?
38, 40 minutes left.
Oh my goodness, I'm going to just go. Okay. Oral history and traditional knowledge under this perspective cannot be measured in this way and is therefore disregarded. I have talked to you about the many problems I have faced to get the historical information of my people to the general public. I understand why they have not been told. I understand why we have gotten to the point we are at today. There is still shame out there to engage in conversation with my people. There is still a lot of work to be done to get to a point where we can actually work with each other beyond the embarrassment and the fears we have of one another. If I am to leave you with one message today, it is this: we are human beings. We are all human beings. We have passions, we have fears, we have feelings, and most of all, we have heart. And we do care about the people who have come here from places beyond our understanding. We have welcomed you and we have supported you. We ask that we be treated in the same way. The secret treaty must be told. The story must be widespread. Think of this story, the secret treaty. I have no more fingerprints, that's why I can't flip pages. I'm going to yield my time to my son here, Finn, in a few moments, but there is something here I want to share with you first. It's important because it also implicates you, your race of people, and that is the inherent rights that we all have. I probably will not find it. It's usually the case, and I cannot find it. But anyway, I'll tell you about Canadian Indian policy. I wrote a paper probably back in the 90s. I don't even know where it is now. But it was a historical review of Canada's Indian policies. And in doing and understanding the stories from all the different people that came here, there's a lot of similarities if you remove the land question. If you remove the land question, there's lots of similarities in the way people were treated, particularly those that come from places of persecution. There's a lot of that's been going on. And it's important to understand that in the context of relationship building. Canada's Indian policy, in reviewing that, Canada's Indian policy, we find that they have been applied systematically, consistently, and devastatingly for the Indian peoples. Suddenly, over 100 years, Indians and lands reserved for the benefit of Indians began the process of devolution. In the name of progress and assimilation into the mainstream of Canadian society, the rights and freedoms of the Indigenous people of Canada have been trampled on and reduced unilaterally by Canada. The main objectives of Canada's Indian policies is rooted in British tradition and practice and have 5 basic objectives: the civilization of Indians, the enfranchisement of Indians, the integration of Indians, the assimilation of Indians, and the termination of Indian rights. Under the British North America Act of 1867, Section 9124 constitutionally delegated the jurisdiction over lands and lands for the benefit of Indians to the federal crown from the British Crown. The British colonial government enacted the Civilization of Indian Tribes Act in 1867 and in 1869, an act for the gradual enfranchisement of Indians and the better management of Indian affairs. The Department of the Secretary of State was delegated the responsibilities for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. The policies of civilization and enfranchisement of Indians are continuing in Canada today. We haven't gone that far away from this kind of policies. In the Saskatchewan Federation of Indians wrote this in 1930. And this was about the pass and the permit system. You could not leave the reserve unless you had a signed document from the Indian agent to go see a relative in the next reserve. You needed that thing. And usually they put the time so that it was so constricted that you're not going to make it there, right? So those passes, and if you were caught without that on your person, you went to jail. You went to jail, sometimes 2 or 3 days, 5 days. In the life of a person that is surviving off the land, that's quite a long time. So the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians wrote this: reduced to prisoners on their reserves, the Indians were entirely at the mercy of government. If they wanted to hunt or trap, they were forced to sneak off the reserves. In the first few years after the implementation of the pass regulation, the Indians were not allowed to hunt because the practice supposedly encouraged barbarism. My God, we're all barbarians, those of us that hunt now, eh? Go get your license to hunt. It is these things that has to become part of open discussion in our communities. I know I had a meeting at Swan Lake, and I invited all of our neighbor communities to come, and we were just going to discuss these issues. And what I did that day was I got our powwow dancers and a drum group to start the meeting. They started singing, everybody was wondering what's going on, you know. And I just told the dancers, just come and dance through the hall and then go straight outside. And my first comment was this: was that so scary? Because that was what was outlawed. The practice of Indian people. You couldn't even dress like an Indian. You couldn't, if there was a town with more than 300 people, the Indians were moved away. This is our history. This is the history of this country. These secret treaties, hey, no wonder they're secret. And there was a lot of them, a lot of them. I have hundreds of stories of treaties. And I'm not saying that we went around having treaties or walking around with a peace pipe in our mouth 24/7. We didn't do things like that. We were busy doing some other things, right? The one thing that concerns me in this time of reconciliation is that our people who are forcing spirituality down your throats. That concerns me. It didn't work. We didn't like it when Christianity was shoved down our throats. And we shouldn't be doing that to people today. And it's sad. I have to go around to schools and put out fires because somebody came in there and had whatever they did right. I have to go in and so I always caution school divisions. Now I'm working with 5 school divisions. Part of this secret treaty book is part of that curriculum. And I'm going to yield my time here to my son here. He wants to tell his story. It's a very, very important story. And I kind of pushed him out the door. You got to tell this. You got to tell this, right? Because it's important. And he's living proof that reconciliation can work. Mr. Finn? Oh, his name is Finn Rachul.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. And thank you to everyone involved for giving me this opportunity to tell my story to a community like this. This is only the 3rd time I've told this story, and I feel so privileged that I can be here to tell it to a community like you guys. So my name is Finn Rachul, and in the spirit of truth, reconciliation, and the action movement, I'm going to talk about my experiences living with the Ojibwe of southern Manitoba as someone of Mennonite background. So a bit about me. I'm Mennonite by background from the Morden area and surrounding Mennonite communities. Funny story, when I took an ancestry DNA test expecting some exotic results from across Europe, I learned that I'm actually 90% German Mennonite, which money well spent, or not, depending on how you look at it. I grew up across Manitoba, frequently moving as is typical for an RCMP family. When I was 10, we eventually settled in the Morden area, where I lived until I left to travel at 18. This upbringing was challenging, marked by many of the typical dysfunctions and traumas associated with being an RCMP kid. Compounding this was my adoption of radically conservative Christian ideas and politics of the community and people around me, which proved detrimental to my well-being in the long run. By the age of 13, I began to think critically about these beliefs, having absorbed the highly conservative attitudes from around me. By 16, I was expressing even more extreme views, influenced by far-right media outlets. This included a distrust of science regarding climate change and evolution, disapproval of non-binary lifestyles, and a misguided belief that Indigenous people were largely freeloaders, alcoholics, or criminals. I was quite terrified of Indigenous communities from the stories that I heard up to that point, but boy, was my perspective about to change dramatically. Shortly after turning 16, I met David Scott at a homeschool event. He came to a local library to do a blanket exercise, a storytelling method that describes the atrocities and land loss experienced by the Ojibwe of Manitoba. At this point, I was a little skeptical. All my instincts from what I had absorbed at that point were telling me he was going to be another Indigenous person guilting us white people for what our ancestors had done. But I was about to be hugely surprised. The things that Dave taught us that day took me off guard. Everything he said seemed to be rooted in history and without blame. He simply told the story as it was in the kindest and most understanding way. Shortly afterward, as we were cleaning up, being interested in languages and cultures at the time, I approached him. I vividly remember that moment when I asked him to teach me more about his language and culture, as this would quite literally be the most life-altering conversation I have ever had. Months later, Dave would contact me for coffee and conversation. I remember being extremely nervous and hesitant, but also curious about the stories he told me about my Mennonite history in the area. After several conversations like that, we became good friends. Here was an unjudgmental, kind, and compassionate person that completely altered my whole conception of Indigenous people. Later that year, Dave invited me to join his Indigenous environmental program at Swan Lake First Nation, which I quickly accepted. The program involved the teaching of a group of Indigenous and non-Indigenous youth from across the area about Indigenous issues as well as traditional environmental knowledge. In the end, the first summer was me and 5 other kids from the reserve exploring creeks, hiking parks, and learning about plants and animals from Dave, spying on muskrats. Along with that, we met with lots of different people from the area, including elders and Western scientists. The group became fast friends, and for the first time, I experienced true acceptance for who I was from the group, Dave, and the old people of the reserve. From there, me and Dave grew closer, eventually developing a relationship called Gwime in Ojibwe. This word describes a lifelong commitment to learn from each other. Dave teaching me about Ojibwe culture and traditional knowledge, and me sharing the things that I've experienced in my own life. From these teachings, I learned how to become a strong human being, living life fully and in my own way. Fast forward 5 years almost to the day, and I've learned and changed a lot. I participated in 4 years of our Indigenous environmental program and took a leadership role this year. Along with that, I grew into the Ojibwe community, with the word Guzis meaning son, and I was traditionally adopted into Dave's family and adopted it just as my own, gaining a huge family across the province. Since then, I've traveled, went through college, and gotten into a lot of trouble with Dave. Thinking about the time we burnt my car's engine and it lit on fire. Things aren't perfect, nothing ever is, but through this healing journey, I've come to know who I was, who I am, and where I'm going. I gained a family, renewed my relationship with my parents, healed from past traumas, and learned to see people as human beings first. From a past of judgment, hurtful Christianity, bad politics, and closed-mindedness, I now call Swan Lake family. I found myself through the kindness and teaching of Indigenous people I once judged and was terrified of, and I haven't looked back since. There's been a lot I've learned since then. Since living on the reserve in Swan Lake, I've learned a new way of life from the traditional people there. It's hard to translate and express their teachings in English, but much of it stems from the first law of the word in Ojibwe, Obamadazi. This word describes looking at people as human beings first, with no divisions of race or labels, becoming a full, flourishing human being, living as part of the environment instead of separate from it, and living a peaceful, fulfilling life within your community. It is this law of life that allows a white person like me to become part of and participate in the Ojibwe community I live in now. Human experience on the land is another very important aspect of Ojibwe culture. While I've learned a lot from my 2 years at college, I've gained as much, if not more, with my time with Dave and the old people. Ojibwe environmental knowledge is not something that can be learned in books or online. Just as this traditional knowledge was gained from observation and living with the land, we have to do the same if we're to learn about the environment we live in too. Everything Dave has taught me, from the relationship between species like muskrats and beavers, how trees speak, the movement and interactions of water, or even the many teachings and life lessons of Ojibwe culture, have to be learned through first-hand experiences out in nature and seeing it happen right in front of you, some of which have never been discovered by Western science and textbooks. There is so much to gain from conversations with traditional people like Dave, but it takes an open mind and a willingness to change just like I did. We can never learn from the people that have lived tens of thousands of years in this place we call home now if we are to come at them with a mindset of taking and knowing it all already. In Ojibwe culture, if you aren't there to learn and ask questions, then you know it all already. And along with that, once you've learned these things, it's your responsibility to teach and help others. Now is the time, more than ever, to be asking questions and learning from traditional people. Climate change is advancing rapidly, and it affects us all, Indigenous, Mennonite, conservative, regardless of your position or background. The crisis we are facing is universal. We have much to learn from this old way of life, one of healing and living with the environment that sustains us, looking at people as human beings first, and bringing communities together regardless of race or politics. Part of Ojibwe culture is to leave a good world for the generations after us, and so we must learn to fight for those generations as well as ourselves. It is people like us that are going to grow into this mess that was left to us, and our responsibility to create a world for those who are coming after. We have a long way to go if we're going to reach a point of truth, reconciliation, and full action. If I've learned anything, it's that these issues, from the environment, climate change, Indigenous issues, everything, are closely connected. And if we have a long road ahead of us if we're to fix these things fully. Every generation has a role to play, from your grandparents, parents, you, your kids, and your kids afterwards. So challenge your biases. Ask questions and share your knowledge. Be open-minded, willing to change, and to fight for these issues. If there's any message I can leave you with today, it's this. Look at people as human beings first. Reach out to the people around you, learn, grow, and fight to bring our many communities and peoples together. It took just one step for me. All it takes is reaching out. You never know where your life's path will take you from there. Thank you.
Thank you to Dave and thank you, Finn. And we do have some time for questions. So Jeremy is circulating up there with the microphone, and I will bring this one around. There we go. So we've got one already.
Thank you. Thank you both for that amazing presentation. Mr. Scott, this question is for you. In our culture, a big part of it is forgiveness. And the things that you've shared with us through your book and through your talk today and your other talks, that we have a lot to make up for. We've done a lot of wrongs. And I guess my question is, because we all believe or have parents who believe, or our culture places such emphasis on forgiveness, you and your people would have every right to be seething with anger and bitterness, and you've chosen to go a different route and channel what would be overwhelming negative feelings to teach us white people about treating others as human. And I guess my question is, in addition to just thanking you for your grace and for being forgiving of us for what we have done to you and your peoples, you're teaching us how to forgive. Why are you not consumed with anger and bitterness, I guess is my question. Where do you draw that from?
You know, as a spiritual leader in my community, I see a lot of that anger. And in our teachings, anger is a negative response to something. And negativity is something you create. So in our teachings, part of that is that you must never take the burden of others, the actions of others. They're the ones that are burdened with that, not you. And if we truly believe, and I truly believe, in the first law in our spirituality, and that is to look at people as human beings first. So I live by that. I've lived that way all of my life. My old people taught me that. My wife was white, was German. I know my dad told me, he said, don't marry anybody in this reserve. You're related to everybody. So when I met my wife and brought her home, introduced her to my dad, he said, I just meant the next reserve. Building relationships is a big part of what I do these days. It's been a big part of my life. I don't think I've ever been angry. You know, I can understand why people are angry, but for me to be burdened with that, no thank you. I'd rather work with people. And that's the way I look at these things. And I'm teaching my people to not be angry anymore. There was a group of kids in Morden School, grade 6 kids. They wanted me to look at their land acknowledgements. So I said, okay, let's have a look at them. And in that grade 6 class, these kids did all the land, you know, of the whoever was here. I think I was here too at one point in time. But those kids started saying, and I'm sorry for residential school, I'm sorry for landlord, and they kept on going like this. And I said, whoa, 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 whoa. I said, no. You have nothing to be sorry for. It's the adults in the room that have to work to resolve those differences. I don't want you kids to apologize for anything. Personally, I don't allow my grandchildren to make a land acknowledgement. To me, that's colonialism. It gives me a responsibility that I don't have. But I understand why it's happening. I understand why it's happening. But for me, that's not something I want to do. We all belong here. And I don't even like using the word indigenous, but we got a letter from our national office that we have to start using the word indigenous. Well, Mr. Jonathan Dick here was born, so he's indigenous. So when I talk indigenous, I mean him too. Right? So these words that are being pushed around for political reasons, that's what creates the problem in the first place. So forgiveness, I have nothing to forgive you for. I have nothing to forgive you for. Forgive yourselves if you, that's your responsibility, that's not mine. I don't make comments about your belief system. That's not my job either. I respect what you believe in. That's for you to deal with on your own. My spirituality is extremely personal and private. And I don't bring that out into the open, into these open discussions. Right? We're not evangelical people, so I'm not here to try and recruit you to come to Swan Lake Reserve and live like Finn. Finn is the only one that goes around bragging that he lives on an Indian reserve. Our people don't. I always laugh at that with him. But thank you for that question. Please, you don't put that burden on me to make me feel that way. Okay, thank you. Next question. Did I slew everybody?
Thank you, Elder Scott and Finn, for your compelling information and sharing. I want to bounce off the question of reconciliation. What you said is very moving, and I think it's really very useful for us to consider. Now, what I wanted to, you several times talked about truth and reconciliation, and you said just now that you don't want the bearded people or the white guys to feel constantly they have to apologize, but they should just start to repent inside themselves, I guess. But you talked also about truth and reconciliation, and so I wanted to ask you, do the bearded folks that surround you, do they sometimes, is there an effort at truth and reconciliation where they try to come to you and try to, if not so much heal with you, heal themselves, as you were just talking about? Thank you.
More and more. Let me stand up here because I need to see who I'm talking to. Who was it? Oh, okay. Let me stand up here. More and more, since Truth and Reconciliation started coming out, my calendar filled up. There are communities all around us that are requesting time to sit with me and learn. And we're learning about each other, because that's a big part that's missing. I was talking to one of the gentlemen here from a Hutterite colony down the highway from us. I said, well, what we're trying to do now, instead of me always going out, is we're going to ask you to come in and tell us who you are. There has to be a process within our communities where we have to decolonize our own people, because that's all they know. I have to take the Indian Act out of our Indians, because that's what they know. Even our leadership are forcing the Indian Act on their own people now without them even knowing that that is what they're doing. So when we talk about reconciliation, let me tell you, we have our own racists in our communities and our own ignorant people in our communities. What has been done in this country is it's not an easy thing to overcome. We could keep writing reports and we can keep making suggestions, but if it don't take it into your heart, it will eventually die. When the Colton Bushy case came out, it nearly died. When the discovery of potential graves at residential schools, it nearly died. We made a concerted effort after that to try and continue and revive this process of reconciling our differences and becoming better neighbors, the way it was intended when the people first came here, and what we expected in terms of a relationship with those that are here. So every community, and there's lots of people out there that want to deal with it in a private way, just between that person and me, right? They say, make sure you don't tell the neighbor. Did anybody see your truck come in the driveway? You know, they'll say things like that. There's still fear and there's still embarrassment, and that has to be overcome. I know the Hutterite, the colony, there's two across from us, across the lake, and one up on the valley near my reserve. And we've always had a really good working relationship with the Hutterite colonies. And now they're making a big effort to reach out to us again, which is good. But there's a lot, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I've been trying to retire, but it seems like every time I announce retirement is good, he has lots of time on his hands, now he can come and talk to us, right? So, yeah, truth and reconciliation and the tasks that are put upon all of us to do better for the sake of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. I'll keep fighting as long as I possibly can. And I hope you'll join me on that as well. Thank you. Thank you for that question. I stunned everybody, eh? Yeah, usually what happens. I'm not surprised. You know, I was in one community. The Catholics, the French Catholics in the village of Somerset never reach out to me. They never did. But they brought in a black priest. And immediately that black priest contacted me at the reserve. And I went and spoke there. First meeting, it was only about 4 or 5 people that came. The second meeting, we had to move from the little room that we're in into the bingo hall. There was so much people there that wanted to know what this was. But right when we were getting started there, the issue of the Pope apologizing got in the way. Immediately people started withdrawing. And I've been trying to reach out to that community again, and it hasn't happened. But the Catholic communities are, because of that issue, are not opening the doors to me at all. I mean, I'll keep work with them. I have coffee with them. I go and visit them on their farms and so forth. That's not a big deal for me to do. It's important. There's a man over there that's interested in a question.
So I met you, Dave, a couple of nights ago.
Yes.
And I told you that I had recited the names of the 7 Indigenous signatories to Treaty 1. And you corrected my pronunciation on every one of them. I'm wondering, so this is a history conference, and it's about the 1870 migrants. Do you have in oral history, like, do we know who these 7 guys were? Like, presumably their fathers and husbands and grandfathers. Like, is there oral tradition that we can actually create sort of biographies of these folks? Because I think as, you know, students of history, it's very helpful if we can actually speak about specifics. So, you know, we know where they come from, right? Which nations they were associated with. But do we have other information on them?
Most of those stories are family stories. The person you talk about, their backgrounds in our thinking, it doesn't matter where you came from. You're there, you have a role to play, and that's what you did, right? So that's very Western history thinking that you're asking me to do. I mean, it is possible, absolutely. I know my grandfather because he's my grandfather. I know my great-grandfather because my grandmother told me about her father, right? And my grandmother told me about her grandfather. So I know that history that way. right? And all those people that are leaders within the Ojibwe tribe have that kind of knowledge. The sad part about this story is a lot of those histories are lost. In my reserve at Swan Lake, we started collecting oral histories. We started taping our people and their stories in 1971. Our chief of the day recognized that those stories are going to be lost if our people start dying off, which is exactly what was. So we started doing that, and I took over that file in 1976 when I was 16 years old, because they knew I could speak the language and I knew a lot about our ways of thinking about things and history. So I took on that job. And they moved me in many, many different areas of Indian government and governance and that kind of thing. But I always had a passion for oral history. And I've always done that for my whole 48 years of working life, is to collect these stories. And a lot of those stories that I have now, and they're in the old, mediums, like the VTR video. You used to have a briefcase on your side here with reel-to-reels on it and a great big gigantic camera. Right? And I used to go around to the reserves and collecting history. Even the Dakota people I've recorded. And then we used to have when technology started coming in, they introduced the Betamax. It was still a suitcase on your side, a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller of a camera. Technology, wow, what a wonderful thing. And then they came back with the VHS. And then now it was just a big camera with the cassette inside of it. Technology, right? I'm not very technically savvy. I barely know how to use my phone. So these things that were lost because of what was happening in those communities is a big part of that. You look at the people at Sandy Bay, which were French Roman Catholic people. They didn't see a need for collecting their history. They didn't see a need for that because theirs were church records that they used, right? I have 4 chapters of our relationship with the churches that came to our reserve, the Anglican Church and I think they were Presbyterian at first. I remember in school they asked me, "What religion are you?" I said, "My mom told me I'm a prostitute." I didn't know how to say Presbyterian. Right? And of course, here comes that little cup of orange soap. And see, this is how I had no idea how these things worked. When they gave me the soap, I swallowed it. Right? We didn't know these kinds of things. And when I used to get hit, I used to wonder why they're doing that to me. It didn't matter. I was a little kid. But that rule about not taking people's burdens lived with me all of my life. So I never did that. There's something malfunctioning in that head, the one who was striking me, and I won't take that responsibility away from those people. So that's the way I live my life. So sadly, a lot of these oral historians are gone now. We're lucky in our reserve, and there's other reserves out there that have done the same thing we have, and that is collect our oral histories. It's crucial that I save the stories that I have. And now what I'm doing is I'm going to be putting on headphones and just repeating word for word in the language that they're speaking, just so we can continue and keep sharing it. Hopefully we'll have speakers sometime in the future. The Ojibwe language is a complex language. We have over 6,000 prefixes and suffixes in our language. And it's incredibly difficult to learn unless you're actually doing it. And our language is not a written language. It's not a written language, it's an oral language. There is a lady with us. Yeah, I knew if I kept talking, somebody will put up their hand.
That's perfect. And yeah, I think we have time for just this last one, and then Jonathan Dick was going to say a few words as well.
So if I want to interpret what you're saying, the family stories as they pertain to the characters of your ancestors is sort of considered sacred or special to the family and not to be shared with outsiders. And yet you talk about other stories that you do share with us. So I'm curious to know how you differentiate what is shared with us Mennonites and what is considered sacred to the family. This is just a follow-up to the question that the other gentleman asked.
Okay, I get it. All the stories that were collected in Swan Lake were collected with the understanding that those people are telling their stories so that we could teach and carry these stories forward. But that's the idea behind the way we bring our stories, is to just from one generation to the next, is just keep teaching. So everybody that was recorded in all of the communities that I've been to gave permission. I want to tell my story so that it's not lost and so that it will be taught to the next generation of young people. So that's why we done it. Okay, this guy is just chomping at the bit here. Is anybody going to introduce you? I don't know him that well. Thank you all very much.